Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey. A very slow, very gentle stroll through one of history's quietest mysteries, the lost years of Jesus. You know, those decades between age 12, when he pops up in the temple, being annoyingly precocious, and age 30, when he suddenly reappears, ready to start his public ministry. It's like the ultimate historical intermission, the cosmic snooze button, the part of the story where historians collectively shrug and say, yeah, we have no idea. But let's imagine. So, dim the lights, settle into your bed, maybe get a warm drink, and let's float into this almost blank canvas of history. We start naturally with the context. Jesus was born somewhere around 4 BCE in a small town called Bethlehem, which, if you're picturing bustling city life, let's just agree was more like a dusty village with a few goats and probably a lot of confused travelers. His family was Jewish, which meant he was expected to follow the usual religious education of the time. At age 12, he makes that famous visit to the temple in Jerusalem, showing off his knowledge of scripture and mildly impressing some priests. Then, poof, he vanishes from the historical record, and he doesn't reappear until he is about 30. 18 years of relative quietude. Let's consider what might have been happening during those years. He could have stayed in Nazareth, helping his father Joseph with carpentry, learning the practical skills of woodwork. Imagine Jesus sanding a plank of wood, thinking about parables in the background, and maybe muttering, "Blessed are the patient, for they shall finish their tables." It's mundane. It's peaceful. It's exactly the kind of thing you want to drift off thinking about. Of course, we have no records, so this is conjecture, but historically plausible conjecture. Some theorists suggest he traveled. India, Persia, Egypt. Each destination comes with its own sleepy possibility. In India, perhaps he learned meditation techniques and discussed philosophy with monks, sitting under trees and sipping whatever herbal concoctions were in vogue at the time. In Egypt, he might have wandered among temples, quietly observing rituals, possibly thinking, maybe one day people will write about this, or maybe not. The key here is the absence of drama. No battles, no miracles, just slow, contemplative living. Let's drift over to another thought. Family dynamics. Jesus was the eldest or among the eldest of his siblings. He had brothers and sisters, which meant domestic life was probably noisy, sometimes irritating, and entirely human. If he was helping Joseph in the workshop, he was also helping settle arguments over who got the last piece of bread, who cleaned the goat's pen, and who forgot to say prayers properly. You can imagine the irony. A figure later described as perfect, now stuck in the mild chaos of sibling squabbles and village chores. Of course, in imagining these years, we also consider the social and political environment. The Romans were present in Judea, which was mildly oppressive, but mostly inconvenient for small-town life. Tax collectors, local officials, and the occasional Roman soldier meant Jesus would have been aware of authority structures, which may have informed his later teachings about justice, mercy, and the odd metaphor about camels and needles. Again, nothing dramatic, just background noise in the slow hum of life. Now, let's think about education. Jewish boys at the time studied Torah, and the more devout would memorize significant portions of scripture. Jesus likely engaged in this, though probably at his own pace. Maybe he doodled in the margins, Maybe he fell asleep mid-prayer. Maybe he pondered the deeper meanings quietly. It's a gentle image, a contrast to the fiery figure of his later ministry. A young man quietly absorbing wisdom, and probably sometimes yawning through it. Some scholars propose more exotic theories. Perhaps he traveled outside the Middle East. Maybe he encountered Eastern mystics or Greek philosophers, quietly observing, perhaps jotting notes on papyrus, or whispering to himself ideas that would later emerge as parables. These ideas are not well documented, of course, and we lean into them because the historical record itself is silent. And silence, when narrated slowly, is almost hypnotic. He may have also experienced a typical Jewish coming of age. At 13, the bar mitzvah, a rite of passage marking the transition to religious adulthood. This meant learning responsibilities, participating in family and community rituals, and quietly accepting the burdens of tradition. It's a domestic, repetitive, gentle kind of life that builds character, or at least patience. And patience, as we know, is crucial when you eventually become the subject of countless stories and interpretations. During these years, he may have observed and participated in the cycles of farming and village life, planting, harvesting, dealing with droughts or good rains, and watching seasons change. These are quiet, grounding experiences. They're not heroic, but they shape a person quietly, slowly. You can almost hear the soft hum of a small village in Judea, interrupted only by the occasional crowing rooster or the lowing of cattle. It's tranquil, and perhaps that's the point. And then there are the emotional aspects. Perhaps he experienced first loves, mild disappointments, friendships that flickered and faded. Perhaps he doubted, worried, or simply sighed at the monotony of everyday life. All these mundane human experiences may have built the empathy, understanding, and calm patience that later characterized his teachings. The lost years, in this view, were a long, slow gestation of thought and character, like the quiet rising of dough before the baking of bread. So, as we drift through these possibilities, let's not worry about exact dates, events, or miraculous tales. The beauty of the lost years is in the ambiguity, the gentle hovering in uncertainty. History sometimes whispers instead of shouting, and tonight it whispers about a young man quietly living, observing, and learning in ways both ordinary and extraordinary, if you consider the perspective. In the next section, we will explore some of the more fringe ideas about these years, including theories of travel to far lands and mystical apprenticeships. But for now, let's continue to drift gently through Nazareth, imagining a young Jesus sanding wood, helping with chores, and perhaps, just perhaps, thinking deeply about the world and his place in it. So, let's float gently onward. We've lingered in Nazareth, surrounded by sawdust, goats, and the soft chatter of family life. Now it's time to drift into the wider, more speculative sea of theories. Because of course, where the historical record is silent, human imagination rushes in to fill the void. And when it comes to Jesus' lost years, the imagination of historians, theologians, and frankly conspiracy enthusiasts has been working over time. One of the more popular whispers is that Jesus traveled east, to India specifically. Yes, picture it. A teenager leaving behind small-town Judea and wandering across deserts and mountains all the way to the bustling learning centers of India. Why? Well, some argue he might have studied with Buddhist monks. It's an oddly soothing idea. Jesus, sitting cross-legged under a tree, listening to teachings about compassion and detachment, occasionally thinking, yeah, I could use that later. Of course, there's no hard evidence, zero. Just parallels people like to draw between his later teachings and Buddhist philosophy. But speculation is half the fun here, especially when you're listening in the dark, half asleep. Let's not stop at India though. Persia also enters the picture. Zoroastrianism was still around, with its eternal cosmic tug-of-war between good and evil, light and darkness. You can almost hear the gentle narrative overlap. Fire altars glowing at twilight, priests murmuring prayers, and somewhere, a curious young traveler taking it all in. Did Jesus stroll through Persian villages, picking up ideas about duality and weaving them quietly into his own mental tapestry? Maybe. Or maybe he was just home sweeping the floor. Both are equally dreamy scenarios. Egypt, too, has its lobby of supporters. After all, his family did flee there when he was very young, escaping King Herod's paranoia. Some think he may have returned in his teens or 20s, wandering among the temples, learning from priests who guarded centuries of ritual knowledge. Imagine Jesus drifting along the Nile on a small boat, staring at the reeds, perhaps overhearing stories about gods who died and rose again. Parallels abound, and historians note them with a sleepy shrug. The Nile flows on, whether or not he was ever really there. Then there's Greece, because why not add another stamp to his speculative passport? Greek philosophy was everywhere. Stoics with their calm, resigned acceptance of fate. Cynics with their habit of mocking social norms. Epicureans with their gentle pursuit of simple pleasures. Imagine a young man leaning in at the edge of a marketplace, overhearing a debate about virtue, occasionally rolling his eyes, but also filing away an interesting metaphor for later. Again, no proof. But isn't it nicer to imagine him exploring the world instead of endlessly sanding planks of wood? And yet, despite all these exotic theories, the most likely explanation is also the most boring. He stayed home. He lived quietly, studied scripture, did chores, watched seasons pass, attended weddings, and maybe even lost his temper once in a while. Because that's what humans do. The fact that his story leaves this gap might actually be the point. Silence forces us to see the ordinary. And the ordinary, in a way, is what makes his later life stand out so sharply. Still, let's not close the door on wandering. Ancient trade routes did exist. Pilgrims and travelers passed through Galilee. Nazareth was not a metropolis, but it wasn't entirely cut off either. Merchants came through, bringing news of faraway lands. If young Jesus had an ear for stories, he might have heard about elephants in India, philosophers in Athens, or great temples in Babylon. That alone could have expanded his imagination without ever leaving home. Some fringe writers, always the spice in history's stew, take the travel narrative much further. They claim he not only studied abroad, but actively performed miracles overseas, healing the sick in India, debating priests in Egypt, dazzling Greek philosophers with witty comebacks. These are fun bedtime tales, like ancient fan fiction. Not historical, but harmless enough to entertain the drowsy brain before sleep. And yet, for all these speculations, the most hypnotic thought is simply this: what we don't know is bigger than what we do. The silence of these years is its own lullaby. It invites us to imagine endless scenarios, none of them urgent, none of them dramatic. Just slow, wandering possibilities, carried on the breeze of time. As we drift further into these theories, let's soften the focus even more. The truth may never be known, but the quiet of those years is a kind of gift, a pause in the story, a gentle ellipsis. We'll keep floating through it, examining not only where he might have gone, but also how later generations tried to fill in the blanks, with legends, texts, and occasional wild guesses. But for now, let's linger here. A young man, somewhere between Nazareth and the wide world, quietly growing, quietly learning, and leaving behind nothing but silence for us to ponder. All right, let's keep floating. We've gone through the everyday chores and the speculative world tours. Now it's time to dip into the stories that came later, the legends, the apocryphal gospels, and the kind of lore that medieval monks probably copied down with one eyebrow raised. Because when history leaves gaps, human imagination writes the filler text, and often it's much stranger than reality ever could be. First, let's talk about the infancy Gospels. These were written centuries after the fact, trying to add color to Jesus' early years. And, well, they didn't exactly aim for subtle. One story describes little Jesus making clay birds, and then, because of course he did, bringing them to life with a clap of his tiny hands. That's right, toddler miracle worker, flapping birds included. It's whimsical, it's unnecessary, and it's exactly the kind of bedtime absurdity that makes you wonder what the authors were drinking. Another tale has him striking down a neighbor's child who annoyed him. Because apparently, divine patience was still a work in progress at age 6. Don't worry. He later brings the child back to life, as if to say, see, no harm done. But the story has that strange mix of casual power and petty squabble, like an early draft of divinity not quite polished yet. If you're drifting off to sleep, just imagine the neighborhood gossip. Don't cross that carpenter's kid. He might smite you before dinner. Other apocryphal stories describe him stretching pieces of wood for Joseph, because if your dad is a carpenter, why not use your powers to save time in the workshop? These little tales, whether charming or unsettling, try to explain how a boy destined for greatness might have practiced on smaller stages. It's like superhero origin stories, but set in dusty villages with fewer explosions. Centuries later, legends spread even further. Some medieval writers claim Jesus traveled to Britain. Yes, Britain. As in, windswept hills, druids, and misty fields full of sheep. According to the tale, he visited with Joseph of Arimathea, possibly checking out tin mines in Cornwall. Was he really there? Almost certainly not. But the idea stuck, and even William Blake later wrote that famous line, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green?" The answer is no, but it makes for a soothing image. Jesus strolling through damp grass, squinting at grey skies, maybe wishing he'd packed a warmer robe. Other traditions placed him among mystics in the Himalayas, or quietly meditating in caves near the Dead Sea. The Essenes, a Jewish sect known for their austere lifestyle and love of scrolls, have often been roped into these theories. People like to imagine Jesus hanging out with them, scribbling notes in the margins of what would later become the Dead Sea Scrolls. Again, no evidence. But the silence invites speculation, and speculation loves a good cave. By the Middle Ages, The lost years have become a canvas for theological creativity. Pilgrims asked questions, storytellers supplied answers, and each culture added its own flavor. To the East, he was a wandering sage. To Europeans, he was a secret traveler. To mystics, he was a hidden initiate in mystery schools. Each tale reveals more about the storytellers than about Jesus himself. But they're calming to drift through, like half-remembered dreams. Even in modern times, books pop up with titles like The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, claiming he studied in monasteries or left secret teachings behind. Most historians roll their eyes gently, but the popularity of these ideas speaks to a universal desire to fill in the quiet spaces. Humans don't like gaps in stories, and yet here we are, resting in the biggest narrative gap of all. What's fascinating isn't whether these legends are true, they almost certainly aren't, but that they reveal how people across centuries wanted to imagine him. Was he a child prodigy, a traveling mystic, a miracle-working carpenter's apprentice? Each version reflects the hopes and anxieties of the era that invented it. In that sense, the lost years belong less to history and more to imagination. And imagination, when whispered at night, is almost as soothing as fact. So, as you rest here, picture the mosaic of legends like stars in a quiet sky. Each one shines faintly, pointing in different directions. None of them quite line up, but together they form a constellation of possibilities, each gentle, each harmless, each strangely comforting in its ambiguity. Now let's ease into the quietest part of all. We've sifted through chores, speculative travels, and a whole catalogue of apocryphal bedtime fan fiction. But beneath it all lies something even more soothing: silence. The lost years of Jesus are, at their core, a blank space. And sometimes, blank spaces are more powerful than any story we try to scribble on top of them. Think about it. Nearly every major figure in history comes with detailed records, dates, battles, scandals, and receipts. But here, for almost 2 decades, we get nothing. Just the faint whisper of a life being lived quietly. It's a reminder that even the most famous lives are mostly ordinary hours. Eating, sleeping, working, growing. And that ordinariness is oddly comforting. If 18 years of calm obscurity were good enough for him, or good enough for him, then maybe your own slow Tuesday night isn't such a big deal either. Let's imagine what silence looks like in a village like Nazareth. Days defined not by miracles, but by the rhythm of sunrises and sunsets. Quiet conversations with neighbors. Long walks along dusty paths. Helping someone fix a roof. Standing in line at the well, waiting for water. None of it is remarkable. All of it is necessary. A life built not on spectacle, but on small, repeated actions. It's not exciting, but that's exactly why it's restful to think about. Historians often point out that silence itself tells a story. If no one wrote about these years, maybe it was because nothing worth noting happened. And nothing happening can sometimes be the most relatable thing of all. We've all had stretches of life where it feels like we're just existing. School, chores, waiting for the next chapter. The lost years whisper to us that even in the life of someone later called divine, those stretches existed too. Of course, silence also invites projection. Communities across centuries filled the gap with what they wished to see. A prodigy, a sage, a traveler, a mystic. But maybe the truth is simpler and also softer. Maybe those years were just a time to grow quietly, to prepare inwardly, to mature without spectacle, like seeds beneath the soil, hidden, silent, but slowly gathering strength. And there's another angle, the narrative rhythm of the Gospels themselves. By skipping nearly 2 decades, they keep the focus sharp. Childhood, then ministry. No distractions. No anecdotes about teenage Jesus sneaking off from chores or learning how to haggle at the market. It's an edited story, streamlined. The silence is intentional, and that makes it even more interesting. A deliberate pause in the soundtrack makes the music more powerful when it begins again. Let's float further into this thought. Silence is not just absence, it's space, it's potential, it's the pause before a breath, the empty stretch before a sentence begins. The lost years function like that. They're not a mistake in history's record keeping. They're a kind of narrative breath, an inhale before the exhale of the public ministry. And in that sense, they mirror our own lives. Everyone has lost years, times where nothing much seems to happen, at least on the outside. Years that feel blank in the scrapbook. But later, when you look back, you realize they were shaping you quietly, invisibly. Maybe that's what was happening in Nazareth too. Not journeys, not miracles, not legends. Just slow, steady growth. Invisible at the time, but essential to everything that came later. The silence also resists control. No matter how much we speculate, we can't fill it fully. It remains its own quiet territory, belonging to no one. And perhaps that's why it's so alluring. It reminds us that not everything can be explained. Not every detail can be recovered. Some parts of history simply remain blank. And that's okay. So as we close this gentle reflection, picture those lost years not as a mystery to solve, but as a kind of gift. A reminder that silence has value, that ordinary days matter. Those gaps in stories can be just as meaningful as the stories themselves. And that sometimes the most powerful moments aren't the dramatic ones, but the quiet ones, when nothing much seems to happen at all. Let's drift into the final stretch of our journey. We've imagined chores, speculative travels, miracle birds, and the profound silence itself. Now let's think about what happened afterwards. How later generations, cultures, and storytellers took this 18-year gap and made it their own. Because the lost years didn't just vanish into nothingness. They became a canvas, and countless people have picked up the brush to paint their version of what they wanted those years to mean. First, the church. Early Christian writers didn't seem bothered by the gap. They simply left it. To them, the ministry was the important part, not the preparation. But as centuries passed, people grew curious. And curiosity, in religious contexts, tends to sprout legends like weeds. By the medieval period, stories of young Jesus traveling, teaching, or even adventuring popped up in sermons and manuscripts. They weren't considered canonical, but they filled the silence in ways that comforted believers. Different regions added their own flavor. In the Middle East, some storytellers emphasized him as a young mystic, steeped in hidden wisdom before returning home. In Europe, the British legends we mentioned earlier gave him a Celtic detour, adding local pride to the global story. Each tradition essentially said, yes, he was here, too. Our land touched his life. It was a way of tying local identity to the universal story, even if the evidence was paper-thin. Mystics and esoteric groups took things even further. For them, the lost years were proof of secret knowledge, teachings too profound to make it into the Gospels. In their view, Jesus learned from sages, perhaps held private initiations, and came back with wisdom too lofty for the masses. This turned the silence into a mystical treasure chest. The less we knew, the more they could claim. Silence became not a void, but a well of secrets. And then, of course, modern times. The 19th and 20th centuries saw a flood of books with dramatic titles. The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ, Jesus in India, The Essene Connection. Each promised to reveal what really happened, and each was basically speculation dressed up as scholarship. Still, they sold well. People wanted answers, and the mystery itself was half the appeal. Even today, documentaries and YouTube videos pop up with soft background music and sweeping claims about lost gospels or hidden manuscripts. You can almost hear the narration. What was Jesus doing during those years? The fact that no one actually knows just makes it juicier. But beyond the claims and counterclaims, the legacy of the lost years lies in what it teaches us about storytelling itself. Silence, when left in the middle of a story, doesn't fade away. It grows. It becomes a mirror. People look into it and see what they want to see, whether it's wisdom, wanderings, or simply the dignity of an ordinary life. That's why the gap has endured for so long, not as a problem to be solved, but as an invitation to imagine. It also shows us something about how cultures shape history. No story ever stays the same. Each generation edits, adds, or projects onto it. The lost years gave them permission to be creative, to add their own brushstrokes to the portrait. That might frustrate historians, but it's deeply human. Where there's mystery, there's meaning-making. Where there's silence, there's invention. And finally, maybe the legacy is this, that we're still talking about it tonight, centuries later. A gap in a biography has turned into hours of speculation, reflection, and storytelling. That's a powerful thing. The lost years remind us that history isn't just about what happened, it's also about how we imagine what might have happened. And in that imagination, we find a strange kind of peace. So, as you rest now, think of the lost years not as a puzzle to solve, but as a lull in the song. A long, quiet note that makes the melody stronger when it returns. Whatever happened between age 12 and 30, whether it was carpentry, travel, or simply silence, it was part of the story. And perhaps it was the most human part of all. We've wandered through carpentry and chores, speculative journeys, miracle birds, long silences, and the legacy of legends. But let's linger a little longer, drifting in this quiet twilight of history. Because sometimes, the ending isn't really an ending, it's a soft winding down, a slow tapering of thought. So let's stay with the lost years just a while more, circling gently like leaves on a calm stream. One reflection worth holding on to is how ordinary time gets overlooked. The Gospels, like most historical records, skip over the quiet years. They move from headline to headline: birth, temple, ministry, crucifixion. But life is rarely made of headlines. Most of it is small moments, like mending a tunic, laughing with a sibling, or taking a slow walk after dinner. The lost years remind us that the texture of a life is woven not only from the loud public chapters, but also from the private, uneventful ones. It's comforting, isn't it? To think that someone remembered as extraordinary might have spent most of his youth doing utterly ordinary things. Perhaps he stubbed his toe on uneven stones. Maybe he got frustrated trying to fix something in the workshop. Perhaps he rolled his eyes at a younger sibling's whining. These small, unnoticed details make him not less, but more relatable. The lost years suggest that divinity, if there was divinity, lived quietly inside the mundane. There's also something sleep-inducing about thinking of him simply growing up. Year after year, slowly, steadily, imperceptibly. His voice deepened. His hands are toughening from work. His thoughts stretch toward questions bigger than his village. No urgency, no rush. Just slowly becoming. It's like watching a tree grow. You don't notice the change day by day. But over time, it becomes something strong, something rooted. And then, when the time came, he stepped forward. The silence broke, and the ministry began. But the pause beforehand was just as much a part of the story as the words that followed. You can't separate the song from the rest between the notes. The lost years were the rest, and without them, the music would sound incomplete. If we drift out wider, beyond history, the lost years also give us permission to accept our own. Not every year has to be filled with achievement. Not every moment has to be remarkable. Sometimes the most important growth is invisible, happening quietly while nothing much seems to occur. That's what the silence whispers. Your ordinary days are not wasted. They are the soil from which everything else will grow. So, as we close this final part, let's picture again that village in Galilee. The sun is setting over the hills, the smell of wood shavings in a small workshop. A boy becoming a man, slowly, quietly. Nothing written down, nothing recorded, just life unfolding, day by day. The mystery of the lost years isn't in what we don't know, it's in the reminder that even the most ordinary days can carry extraordinary weight. Let that image carry you now, softly, into your own rest. 18 years of silence, 18 years of life. No drama, no noise, just the gentle passage of time, shaping everything that was to come. We've reached what feels like the natural end of the story, but perhaps the lost years still echo a little further. Sometimes, after a song finishes, the notes seem to hang in the air for a while, resonating quietly in the mind. So let's sit with those echoes, and let them guide us through one last slow wander. It's worth noticing how many traditions, far outside Christianity, took the silence and filled it with their own reflections. Some imagined him walking to India, soaking up ideas about meditation and compassion. Others pictured him in Egypt, learning from priests and philosophers. Still others thought he stayed right where he was, and that the wisdom he carried later was born from simple village life. Each culture projected their own longings onto the empty space, and in that way, the silence became a mirror. What we believe about those lost years often says more about us than about him. And maybe that's the point. Mystery is a canvas. The less we know, the more we paint. That's why these years keep inspiring theories, books, legends, and late-night speculation. It's why we're still here, 2,000 years later, talking gently about them in the quiet of the evening. The gap itself has become meaningful, like a blank page in a manuscript that somehow holds as much weight as the words around it. There's also a softer truth hidden here. Most of us will never be remembered for the grand chapters of our lives. If we're remembered at all, it may be for the small, everyday kindnesses that no one wrote down. The lost years remind us that history, for all its kings and queens and conquerors, is mostly made of lives unrecorded. And those lives matter, even if they slip silently through the cracks. Imagine now the quiet rhythm of a carpenter's workshop, the hush of desert evenings, the soft murmur of family voices fading into sleep. Imagine long stretches of uneventful days that no one thought to mark. That is what most life looks like, and that's okay. It is enough. So, as this 7th part drifts to its close, let's let the echoes fade gently. The lost years don't need solving, they don't need filling in. Their silence is their gift. They remind us that the quiet parts of life are not emptiness, but presence. They are not wasted, but essential. Close your eyes then, with that thought. 18 years, barely a whisper in the records, yet a whole world of life lived in the shadows of history. A lull in the story that carries its own quiet music. A silence that asks us only to rest. And here we are again, stretching the silence just a little further. Because history, like a comfortable evening, sometimes deserves to be drawn out. Think of this part not as a new chapter, but as a slow exhale, the kind that makes your shoulders drop and your mind quiet down. The lost years have given us speculation, legend, philosophy, and reflection. But let's not forget they also reveal something about how history itself works. For every famous figure, there are countless blank spaces. Emperors vanish from the record for months or years. Queens leave gaps in their letters. Children grow up off stage, only to reappear when they're politically useful. Silence isn't rare. It's the rule. What's rare is the noise of history, the moments that someone bothered to write down. So perhaps the lost years of Jesus aren't exceptional at all. Perhaps they're perfectly normal. Maybe what's strange is that we expect the extraordinary to be fully documented, when in reality, most of existence is undocumented. That thought can feel oddly soothing. If so much is forgotten, then the pressure to leave a mark fades. It's enough to live, even if no one notices. We can picture scribes and storytellers choosing what to include and what to leave out. They wrote what they thought mattered: miracles, speeches, dramatic events. They passed over dinners, naps, idle conversations, or quiet afternoons repairing sandals. Those things didn't seem worth preserving. Yet ironically, those are the very things that make life feel real. It's like looking at an old photograph album where half the pages are blank. At first, you might feel frustrated at what's missing, but after a while, the empty spaces begin to say something on their own. They speak of time unrecorded, life unposed, and reality unpolished. That's the music of the lost years. And maybe that's the lullaby we can take from this story. Not every detail needs to be filled in. Not every mystery needs to be solved. The silence itself has texture, weight, and calmness. The lost years are like the long yawn of history, slow, unremarkable, and yet deeply human. So let's let that yawn carry us to a slow stretch into the night, a gentle drift away from speculation, away from questions, away from the need to know, just resting in the comfort that sometimes the most important story is the one that isn't written down at all. And now, at last, we arrive at the closing sigh. Part 9, the final drift. Think of it as a candle burning low, the flame shrinking into a soft glow before the wick settles into darkness. There isn't much more to say, and that is exactly the point. The lost years have carried us through speculation, imagination, and silence. They've shown us carpentry, wandering legends, invisible growth, and the way blank spaces hold their own kind of story. And now we simply rest in that thought, because not every story needs a sharp conclusion. Some stories are lullabies. They fade instead of ending. Picture again the hills of Galilee. The air is cooling at dusk. Crickets begin their chorus. A young man sitting quietly, perhaps thinking of nothing at all. That moment, never recorded, never remembered, is as much a part of history as any miracle or sermon. It is history's soft heartbeat, steady and unremarkable. What did he do between 12 and 30? Maybe nothing is worth writing down. Maybe everything that truly mattered. The silence leaves room for both, and maybe that's the secret gift of the lost years. They let us rest in mystery, instead of scrambling for answers. So, let's take that gift and close our own eyes. Let's drift with the silence, unhurried, unbothered. 18 quiet years stretched out into an evening's meditation, a space where time slows and sleep can finally come. That's where we'll leave it, on the hush of history's softest chapter. Not with noise, not with certainty, just with quiet.